Well, it is a great honor to be back here with you all, and I'm honored that you would get up this morning and come be part of this time together. I'd like to think about your identity as followers of Christ in a couple of different dimensions. We all have a certain inner face as Christians that looks back. It looks back to the past. It looks back, obviously, to the biblical past. We look all the way back to Adam and Eve and Abraham and Moses and David and the prophets and John the Baptist and Jesus and Paul. And depending on our denomination, we have other people of the more recent past that we look back. It might be John Calvin. It might be John and Charles Wesley. It might be Billy Graham. It might be Benny Hinn. But we have some number of people in the past who, when we call ourselves a Christian, an evangelical, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Pentecostal, we're connecting ourselves in some important way in the past. But we also have a dimension of our faith that has to look toward the future. And this, I think, in many of our Christian settings is underappreciated. And I'd like to explore that a bit with you in the next few minutes as well. There's a part of our Christian identity that requires us to become firmly centered and placed in the present so that in this present moment we're able to look out and see the world that's around us today, and also in a real sense look within and see our own soul, see what's going on inside of us, so that in some way our identity as a follower of Christ can integrate these three dimensions. Yes, we are part of a tradition inherited from the past, and in this moment, we're living it and negotiating it and inhabiting it, experiencing it, and we're also thinking about the future and thinking about how the Christian faith, once it has passed through our generation's hands, so to speak, will leave slightly reshaped with a different set of fingerprints, and what will our legacy be of passing the faith on to others. And it's not easy living in the middle of these different identities. Very often, the responsibility and heavy weight of faithfulness to the past can seem deadening and can seem almost an enslavement sometimes in the present, and even keep us from thinking about the future because we're just trying to deal with the past and the present. So I'd like us to give ourselves in these next few minutes a chance to try to balance these three different dimensions of our faith. Yes, it's true that faith in many ways is an inheritance. It doesn't matter if you're Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Jew, even atheist or agnostic. You are part of a tradition that you inherit, and you have a responsibility to receive that inheritance. And that's one of the things I'm sure that your professors are helping you do in an institution of Christian higher education. They're helping you to savor this rich, rich heritage that has come to you. It's so beautiful that we started this service with words from a strange and wonderful and fascinating man, 12th century man whose words and examples still inspire us in the 21st century. We really have received an inheritance, and many of us are taught that we have to receive that inheritance, master it, and pass it on to the next generation with absolutely no change. The goal of this thing is to receive it and pass it on with pristine purity. Receive a pure message, don't mess it up, and then pass it on exactly as it is. But a lot of times, part of coming of age, part of what happens in that range from, let's say, age 11 to age 29, is experiencing some frustrations with the inheritance you received. To say, you know, this message, this version of Christianity I've received, I'm not entirely happy with it. Yeah, it's helped me in some ways, but it's also done some damage to me in some ways. It was mentioned there's been a very important gathering of scholars here these last couple of days around the subject of post-colonial evangelical Christian theology. And one of the things that these scholars are talking about is the fact that the Christian faith that we inherited is a faith that spent several hundred years in the hands of colonial powers, British colonial powers, sometimes Dutch colonial powers, sometimes Portuguese and Spanish colonial powers, and a few other nations as well, and very much now American powers that have a colonial feel to them. And part of what is involved, being the age of the average college student, part of what's involved is assessing the version of the faith that you inherited and being willing to ask those difficult questions. If you take the Christian faith and you fuse it with a colonial and imperial approach to power and economics for 500 years, have you actually inherited a faith that is as pure and pristine as you've been told? And so there's this natural process when you're deciding, is this faith my parents' faith that I'm going to push aside? Or is it a faith that I'm going to receive and have to question and adapt to make my own? And I think this cartoon expresses what an awful lot of us are made to feel. Now, I know that you can make people a little bit nervous to have to question and to see questioning as part of your faithful Christian identity. But just look back and think about it. If people hadn't been willing to question what they were taught as Christian faith, then we would have to still believe that we were part of a universe where the earth was in the center and there were 10 concentric crystalline spheres around the earth. Because you understand there was a period of time where you were in danger of imprisonment, torture, and killing by the church if you questioned that view of the universe. But over a period, first of decades, and then actually of over a century, one by one, Christians had to say, I'm not going to pass on to my children the version of the Christian faith that I inherited, a version that included a worldview that I just can't buy. Of course, it happens in the areas of social behavior as well, because deep in our history here in America, we have to acknowledge this. Even though everybody loves to point out William Wilberforce as a great example of standing up against slavery, there were more Christians defending slavery than there were opposing it for a long time. And the odds are that at an awful lot of points in American history, if you would put it to a vote among a majority white population, the vote would not have gone against slavery or against Jim Crow laws and so on. So we have to appreciate that the faith that we inherited has already been through generation after generation of reflection. As a result, we're not in the habit of stoning or torturing people we disapprove of anymore. And as a result, we're not in the habit of blaming epidemics and diseases on witches or curses. But now, many of you are studying biology, and I imagine some of you are pre-med. And for you, your ancestors went through a process of integrating faith with bacteriology and microbiology. And that required them to adjust the faith that they inherited so that they'd pass on a faith that would allow you to be a biology major. Then, of course, the struggle continues. The struggle continues today on issues like evolution and issues like biblical criticism and issues like human sexuality. And an awful lot of people will tell you, you can't ask these questions, or if you do, you aren't welcome around here anymore. Thankfully, though, some parents and some pastors and some institutions of Christian higher education understand it's part of their job to make safe space for people to ask questions and maybe even flirt with answers that later on they'll decide are wrong, but that you have to create some open space for Christian identity to be negotiated and formed and reformed. And I understand, now that I'm the age of most of your parents, I understand that very often your parents went through this kind of questioning themselves 20 or 30 years ago, and now they've forgotten about it, which makes them less empathetic to you when you need to go through this kinds of questioning. In my life, my church context was the place where you couldn't ask questions. We were kind of the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it congregation. You quote a Bible verse, and that would end the discussion, because we didn't have permission to say there's a difference between what the Bible says and what we say the Bible says. For us, you couldn't put a knife in between the Bible and our interpretations of the Bible. They were completely fused. So there wasn't much room for that kind of identity formation for me. But thankfully, my parents did give me that room. And I found from them wonderful space to ask questions. The problem was, my parents, it seems for them, the faith had come so easy. They hadn't really had those kinds of struggles. And I remember feeling when I got to be 16, 18, 20 years old, that if I were to bring my parents the questions I was having, it would just upset them. It would really upset them. And I loved my parents. I didn't want to bother them. But by the grace of God, I had some youth workers and other older mentors who were really able to help me. I'm sure, as many of you have found, both among peers, fellow students, among college staff, among professors, chapel staff, and so on, in a place like this, you found some places where they'd say, oh, here's a good book on that subject. Or they'd say, no, you can talk about that here. That's okay. And they might even say what one of my mentors said to me, Brian, even if you end up reaching conclusions that disagree with me, I want to assure you our friendship will remain intact. My friendship with you, my love for you, is not conditional on agreement. And so I discovered that among my peers, there were some people who it was safe to talk with, and together we went through struggling with that process of taking the faith of the past and trying to say, how can I own this honestly in the present? And along the way, I was so encouraged to find, for example, that the Bible made room for all kinds of honest questions. You know, there are books in the Bible like Job and Ecclesiastes where questions were raised and standard beliefs were questioned. I even saw a book like Galatians in the New Testament in a new light to see that there's this guy named Paul who's standing up to people like Peter and James. I mean, it's a remarkable thing to see that even in the early church, there was tension and there was room for grappling with what the faith was going to be like. And in fact, I started to see the Bible itself as a book of change, a book that recorded change in how people viewed God, change in how people viewed a right way of living. I watched the faith go from a faith held by what you might call hunter-gatherers to a faith held by loose tribal confederacies to a faith held under domination by an empire and slavery to faith that became a liberation movement from empire to faith that was held by a loose confederation of nation states to a faith that became a national faith held by a group of people. You could watch the faith go through these different changes and adaptations over time. I even remember the encouragement of seeing that moment when Jesus, in a sense, has to physically distance himself from his parents, in some way gaining the emotional distance that every new generation needs to gain. You remember the story from the Gospel of Luke. Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Why were you searching for me, he asked. Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? Now, some of us would get in trouble for answering back like that, but anyway. But they did not understand what he was saying to them. And of course, many young adults feel this is how it is with their parents. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and with others. Jesus had room to grow. And his parents even understood at this point that part of their parental role was to allow their son to enter into his own theological space, his own theological conversation. And also for me, and this is one of the great things that happens when you come to an institution of Christian higher education. You meet Christians from other traditions who bring resources and possibilities that maybe your tradition didn't allow you. In a sense, they take one narrow segment of the past and they open it up, and you suddenly find you have more resources than you realized. And of course, I would hope, as you go through this process, that not only are you grappling with a system of belief, but that you actually are having spiritual encounters with a living God as well, that in some way deepen and sustain your soul as you forge a Christian identity that is faithful to the past, but in a way that is not unfaithful to the present and to the future. And so I think we all go through a sorting process. Things that we keep, things that we put aside, things that we're unsure about, things that we have to adapt. And some people will tell you you're not allowed to do that. The fact is, every generation goes through this kind of process. And eventually, my faith it wasn't just my inherited faith, it was my inhabited faith. And this was a faith that I could hold with honesty. And in fact, for me, this meant as I continued to grow, I was in graduate school, then began teaching college English, and got involved with starting a little house church. And eventually I left teaching and became a pastor for 24 years. And one of the great blessings of my life was that I was able to then have space to really be a follower of Christ and not have to be faking it in some way. And the ancient faith that I studied and honored and revered, I was able then to make my own in the present. I actually found by studying the past, there was so much diversity in the past, it gave me a lot more freedom to have space to live out my faith in the present. But I need to tell you a secret about this. I don't want to make it sound like by the age of 29, I had that all worked out. Because the truth is, I don't think you ever grow up. I'm 54, and so far, I'll just tell you, what Jesus said about being like a little child, I think is still true. The older you get, the more you have to learn. The older you get, the more free you are to keep asking questions and keep growing and keep seeking. And I found that adult faith is as living and dynamic. For some reason, none of the adults when I was young let me in on that secret. They made it sound like you get to a certain point and it's just sort of coasting the rest of the way to heaven. But I'm amazed to find, I found this as a pastor as well, that people, as they get older, they continue to need space to cope with new experiences, to cope with new understandings, and their faith stays dynamic. And so in the present, they continue to negotiate what it means, and their identity hopefully deepens and grows richer in their grappling with Christian faith. But I think we also have to talk about the future dimension to faith. Because you're not only the descendant of a tradition. Maybe you've never thought about this before, especially if you're single and you don't have kids and so on. But the fact is, you all are ancestors to tens of thousands of Christians of the future. And, you might not have thought about them yet, but odds are there will be tens of thousands of children and grandchildren to people in this room. And you will have carried on a Christian identity, negotiated and constructed in relation to the past and present, that you will then pass on to them, that they will negotiate and construct and live out their faith in the future. And I don't know if you've thought about your role, but your struggles with your faith are not only for you, they're also to make room for generations to come. This isn't just about you and the past. It's about you, the past, and the future. And so this third face or this third identity to your Christian life it's tremendously important. A Roman Catholic missionary named Vincent Donovan has really helped me think about this in a couple of his books, but his best known is a book called Christianity Rediscovered. Vincent Donovan went to be a missionary. He was from Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, but went to be a missionary at the border between Kenya and Tanzania among the Maasai people and another tribe or two in that region. And in his encounter as a missionary seeking to share his faith with people who had never been directly exposed to Christian faith before, he was forced to question his identity as a Christian. How much of this faith that I'm bringing to these people is really a matter of Western culture European culture, American culture. How much of this is cultural accretion, and what part of this is real gospel? And that process of rethinking eventually spilled out into this book, a beautiful book, Christianity Rediscovered. And here's one of the conclusions he makes at the end of this very important book. Never accept and be content with unanalyzed assumptions about the work, about the people, about the church of Christianity. Never be afraid to ask questions about the work we have inherited or the work we are doing. There is no question that should not be asked or that is outlawed. The day we are completely satisfied with what we have been doing, the day we have found the perfect, unchangeable system of work, the perfect answer, never in need of being corrected again, on that day we will know that we are wrong, that we have made the greatest mistake of all. Now, when I was a sophomore or junior in college, these words would have really frustrated me, because the reason I came to college was to get the perfect, unchangeable system, finally. And I figured by the time I graduated, I would have it. But he's saying, no, that would be the case if there was no future to the Christian faith. But if we have that third face, we have to look into the future. We continue to participate in a living tradition. And that's why he concludes, do not try to call others back to where they were, and do not try to call them to where you are, as beautiful as that place might seem to you. You must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have ever been before. And so we profess faith in a God who was and is to come. And we're called to love our neighbors, and that means our neighbors who are neighbors in the past, our ancestors, and our neighbors in the present, both within and outside the Christian faith, and our neighbors in the future, the ones we haven't met yet because they haven't been born yet. But they shouldn't be left out of the equation just because they don't yet exist, just as people in the past shouldn't be left out of the equation just because they happen to have died already. But we're part of a living tradition. And there's a rather strange metaphor that has become helpful to me in the last couple of years in thinking about this process of building a faith and building an identity. And it's this ugly, strange, but in some ways fascinating creature, the Chambered Nautilus. And the Chambered Nautilus is a deep sea, pelagic creature who occasionally you find a shell washed up on the shore, but it's seldom seen alive. It's related to squids and octopuses, except that it has a shell that it constructs and lives in, almost like a snail shell, but it swims. And what happens with the nautilus is when it starts, you have to look at that very first little smallest chamber. That's where the animal used to live. And as it lived in that chamber, it grew and it started to compose the next dome for it that's too big. It didn't need that space yet, but it was going to need it soon. So all the time it lives in a small chamber, it builds a big chamber, and then it fills that big chamber, and then it walls off the small chamber that it no longer needs, and yet it carries it with it forever. And then the process, you can see, repeats itself season after season. And this Chambered Nautilus inspired a poem by Oliver Wendell Holmes back in the 19th century. And I'll just read part of the poem. Year after year, I beheld the silent toil that spread his lustrous coil. Still as the spiral grew, he left the past year's dwelling for the new, stole with soft step its shining archway through, built up its idle door, stretched in his last found home, and knew the old no more. Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll. Leave thy low vaulted past, till thou at length art free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. And so he captures this image of actually ultimately coming to the time when we leave this life and we enter into the fullness of life that we can't even now fully imagine. I think this is very much what the Apostle Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians 13, which is, not really just a scripture for weddings. It's about life, and it's so relevant to this issue of our identity, because Paul was trying to help Christians discover an identity not centered in a static framework of law that was unchanging, but rather centered in a dynamic experience of love. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Follow the way of love. And so, brothers and sisters, at the heart of it all, I know in some ways to picture past, present, and future confronts us with a lot of change. But at the center is something that doesn't change. This great call, the call from Jesus Christ to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And in that, we find the consistency of our identity as followers of Christ when we look to the past and in the present and in the future. I hope that's been helpful. I hope in some way that gives you a sense of permission to do what you're about to do the rest of the day, to be in classes where you think about your faith in relation to all of life. Thank you very much. God bless you.